I bared my soul to you, and it was just you the whole time?
Yes.
The long-awaited Black Widow solo movie has been out for approximately 2 minutes, so naturally the internet is already turning it inside out, asking questions like, what does this mean for the MCU? Did that twist work? Where might this dangling thread lead? We thoroughly enjoyed the movie, but no Hollywood production has absolutely watertight logic, so in this video, we are going to take a fair and balanced look at some aspects of Black Widow that don't quite pass the refrigerator test. And because we're Mavericks here at ScreenRant, let's start at the end.
Let's drink.
After the airborne Red Room comes crashing down to Earth, General Thunderbolt Ross arrives on scene with approximately 500 shield jeeps. And rather than disappear, Natasha decides to give herself up. Next scene, she's got her kicky blonde Infinity War hairdo and she's heading off to help Cap bust the others off the raft. So what happened with Ross? Let's not forget that at the beginning of the movie, he ruthlessly hunted her down for her actions in Civil War. Were they just gonna sit down for some coffee and discuss Dreykov? It seems unlikely that Ross would, just let Natasha leave. And surely if she wanted to give him intel, she could have just sent an email. Director Kate Shortland has said that they left it deliberately ambiguous, which of course is her decision to make, but it still feels like it raises distracting questions for no real benefit. And while we're on that point, does it really make sense from a character perspective? Natasha has just reunited with her family, patched things up with her little sister, and freed a new army of Black Widows from Dreykov's influence. Wouldn't it have made more sense if she had left with them? After all, they had a lot to talk about. Of course, you could argue that Natasha turned herself in to buy the others time to escape, but let's not forget General Ross and his 500 jeeps. If they put Natasha in one jeep, that still leaves a whole bunch of jeeps to chase Alexei, Yelena, and Melina. And come to think of it, those three would have been pretty useful allies to have when busting Sam, Wanda, and the others off the raft. Hey Cap, you want me to call in my army of Black Widows? Yeah, please. The reveal of the Flying Red Room is a pretty cool twist. It's a great visual and it makes for a fun action sequence, but when you think about it, does having a helicarrier type flying base really make somebody harder to find? From the ground maybe, but not from above. And the Red Room doesn't even have a cloaking device like the helicarrier. You would imagine that maybe a SHIELD satellite would have seen it floating around up there and investigated, or heck, even one of Tony Stark's. Nobody noticed this thing floating up there? The movie finally reveals what happened in Budapest all those years ago, something first alluded to back in Joss Whedon's first Avengers, and it's appropriately heavy for something that's been weighing on Natasha's conscience, but there's one question that keeps nagging at us. The explosion that took out Dreykov's building was massive and serious enough to leave his daughter Antonia with horrible scars, but Dreykov himself seemed to escape completely unscathed. How did that happen? Did he get a last-minute tip, abandon his daughter, and then escape down some secret passageway? He's an evil piece of work, so that would make sense, but the fact that it's never explained in the movie is odd. All it would have taken was a quick line of dialogue. Come on, Marvel, you know how the internet works. You gotta get ahead of this sort of thing. And speaking of that evil piece of work, Dreykov, how does the Red Room's brainwashing mojo actually work? Back in Natasha's day, the Red Room used ruthless methods of indoctrination, military training, and coercive torture to mold its agents, as many real-world agencies do. But with the new generation, Dreykov updated his methods, using microchips and mind manipulation so that he has absolute control over his soldiers. It makes for some horrific moments, like the widow that he forces to kill herself, but it's the kind of thread that, once you pull it, starts to unravel things. Does Dreykov's control have a limit? Are the widow's true selves buried underneath? How aware are they of what's happening? And ultimately, if it can be undone with red spray, is it actually that effective? Our advice? I don't know, maybe just don't turn young women into super assassins at all? And hey, on the subject of super assassins, we love Alexei. We love him when he's being a doofus dad, and we love him when he's punching people. But we have to ask, what is the deal with his powers? Where exactly did they come from? He describes himself as the only one of his kind, and it makes sense that the Soviets would see Captain America and decide that they wanted one of their own. That's how it worked in the real world, after all. But the MCU has made such a big deal about the importance of super soldier serum and how difficult it is to make, so we have to wonder what the backstory is here. Did they steal some? Were they able to make a small amount but not replicate it? Like, if Dreykov is such a well-funded super genius that he can brainwash an army of widows, position them all around the globe and control them from his flying skybase, couldn't he have figured out super soldier serum too? This is more of a character discrepancy, but it's been bugging us. Natasha and Yelena make a big deal about the taking of innocent life. They're against it, as they should be. It's a big part of them growing beyond their past as assassins. But then when they storm the prison to break out Alexei, they seem pretty blasé about collateral damage. Sure, the prison guards probably aren't the nicest people in the world, but they're ultimately just normal people doing their jobs. And while we do see them running inside when the avalanche strikes, it seems pretty likely that in the course of the prison break, some people got hurt badly, maybe even died. But hey, it's a cool action scene, so let's move on. Here's some more behavior that is slightly out of character. After reuniting in Budapest, Natasha and Yelena are on the run from both the Red Room and the US government agencies who are already chasing Natasha. And is it just us, or do they not really make much effort to blend in? Sure, they change their clothes, but as far as keeping a low profile goes, that's about it. They don't even change their hair. Considering that Yelena spends a lot of time mocking her sister for being a big famous Avenger idolized by little girls, it seems odd that they would not try harder to keep under the radar. Not only is she an Avenger, she's a high-profile fugitive. With a continuity as big and complex as the MCU, fans are always going to be asking how new information fits into what we already know, and sometimes when things don't fit, it's just a matter of production reality. So the real reason that Yelena, Red Guardian, Melina, and the Army of Widows do not show up for the big climax of Avengers Endgame ultimately is because Endgame was made before Black Widow. That's the reality. But Marvel must know at this point that fans are going to be asking these sorts of questions, so why not slip a line of dialogue into the movie to preempt the dreaded plot hole conversation? For example, maybe in the post-credits scene, Valentina and Yelena discuss how she and the other widows were left out of that final fight. Maybe Yelena's sad because Natasha didn't ask for her help with Thanos or during the blip. Or hey, maybe they all got blipped away. And speaking of Contessa Valentina Allegra de Fontaine, this last entry is not so much a plot hole, more of a curiosity. Black Widow was originally supposed to come out before The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but of course, the pandemic messed that up. Had things unfolded as planned, when Valentina showed up in the Disney Plus show, we would have recognized her from the Black Widow post-credits scene. So even though we know the reason, her two appearances feel slightly at odds with one another, as if she has two introductions, neither of which really tell us anything, but which still sort of rely on each other. Shared universe continuity, man, it is a nightmare.
Is Tony Stark hiding life-saving tech? Did Thanos make multiple mistakes before Infinity War? And does Bruce Banner have selective amnesia? Were you keen enough to catch the tiny errors Marvel lets slip through the cracks? Don't worry if you weren't, that's why ScreenRant is here to help showcase the most significant plot holes in the MCU. Remember that a plot hole is like a hook or moment that is either illogical to the narratives or left unresolved. That means that you'll see both storyline errors and open-ended questions we want answers to. Even if we don't get them, at least you can join us in this frustration. Look, we're not scientists, but neither are the writers for the Ant-Man movies, so we think it's fair that we toss this critique out to get things started. In the first film, Hank Pym tells Scott Lang that the Pym particle works by closing the distance between atoms. Okay, that makes sense, but it brings up a tricky point. How does someone go subatomic if there's simply moving distance between atoms?
He's right, Hank, and you know it.
We're guessing that viewers were supposed to shrug off this movie science because it's not clear how Ant-Man could get to the quantum realm with that logic. Hopefully, the more science-inclined ScreenRant fans can share ideas in the comments to help us out. Every single person at Marvel is aware of this error. In fact, MCU fans always remember this oddity whenever they go back to watch the first Avengers movie. Here's the deal. We watch as Thanos trusts Loki, the trickster god, with his scepter. It made sense at the time, but the execs at the top decided the Mind Stone would be hidden inside the scepter later. So now we're being led to believe one of two things here. Either Thanos was stupid and didn't know it was an Infinity Infinity Stone, or he did know and entrusted it to the least trustful person in the galaxy. Yeah, not the brightest moment either way, and it doesn't fit the Thanos we come to know later in the franchise. We have another plot hole that doesn't fit any known character detail for someone we're supposed to understand a lot about. We're talking about Howard Stark, the OG billionaire playboy philanthropist. Stark is a super genius whose knowledge was heavily limited by his era. The technology wasn't there to get him towards all the developments his son Tony can make. Iron Man 2 wants us to believe that the smartest man of that time trusted his son to discover the secrets of his designed element inside a blooper reel. Come on, that's illogical. This entire plot point relies on the story just working that way because it has to resolve somehow. It is glaringly silly when you rewatch the film. We already brought it up once, but let's get back to it again. Loki's scepter is a piece of powerful tech. In fact, it ends up holding one of the most powerful objects in the galaxy. For the sake of argument, let's pretend like that's not the case, just to give the MCU some ground here and play fair. Even if it doesn't hold the Mind Stone, why in the world does Thor allow it to stay on Earth? They all saw the serious power it had over people and its alien weaponry. In that same movie, Tony Stark reveals that S.H.I.E.L.D. is trying to create more advanced weapons. Thor leaving the scepter only happens to make Hydra more of a threat in Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron. What is the point of the raft if it can't even hold prisoners for more than a month? The end of Captain America Civil War showcases Steve Rogers breaking all of his allies out of this fortress in the middle of the ocean. Let's be clear, it's a fantastic scene, but does it make sense? Captain America literally just started life as a fugitive. Where is he getting the capacity to get to the raft and break through its levels of security? Sure, Stark is called about the break-in after the fact, but that doesn't explain things. Odds are the film didn't have time to show it and the writers couldn't figure it out either. Maybe you can tell us in the comments. Iron Man 3 is a film absolutely loaded with issues that contradict its entire point. We're led to believe that Stark solved this significant formulaic error in the regrowth technology for lost limbs and serious injuries. A serum like that would change the world. Why then do we never see it again? Okay, it ruins everything by having such a quick fix available in the MCU. Still, we don't even get that explanation. It simply disappears. Don't you think Colonel Rhodes would have a bit of that regrowth after his injury? Stark's holding out on his buddy, man. Now, you can't make a video like this and not get a little nitpicky. It's just our position that this entry showcases that disconnect between the director's production crew and the executives upstairs. There's a graphic on screen during the famous Guardians of the Galaxy police lineup as they head to Nova Corps' prison. Gamora's graphic says that she is the last surviving member of her race. Infinity War certainly tells a different story. We see clearly that Thanos only eliminates half the population. Is Nova Corps just out of the know here? This fact feels like a glaring oversight on their part. How do you lose track of an entire species? It's not like what Thanos did was small news. The arc reactor powers Tony's suit, right? Every movie seems to point to this being the case. Heck, it's a huge plot point in the first film. Obadiah steals the reactor from Tony's chest because he can't figure out how to make one himself. So, it feels safe to assume that that's where his Iron Man suit gets its energy. Why does he need a car battery in Iron Man 3? From a story standpoint, it's meant to slow Tony down and make him research the villain's plan better. From a broader canon standpoint, there's no reason it should need a charge. His reactor works. Why does it need to be battery charged if it's powered by something else? It's a vast oversight. We need to bring up a specific example to prove a point, but this plot hole stems from multiple movies. Can someone, anyone, please define what classifies an Avengers-level crisis? It's a rhetorical question, but no definition truly suffices. The reality is, the Avengers only show up when it makes sense for the movie. Ant-Man and other films even joke about whether or not their crisis is Avengers-worthy.
I think our first move should be calling the Avengers.
So take the second Guardians of the Galaxy film. Ego attempts to assimilate multiple planets with the help of Star-Lord. That's his super evil plan. Obviously, that's a galactic threat on a scale with Thanos' invasion. Where are the Avengers when that ego blob begins to devour that small Missouri town? That's right, they don't even show up. One of the most hyped end credits scenes is in Age of Ultron when Thanos takes out the empty Infinity Gauntlet and exclaims that he'll do it himself. That movie takes place in 2015, 3 years before Infinity War. When we actually get to Infinity War, Atri mentions that Thanos forced the dwarves to make the gauntlet and then extinguish the forge. When exactly did this happen? It's believed that the gauntlet's cast came from Odin's design, and that maybe Loki's rule helped Thanos slip in and make the gauntlet during that time. Still, it isn't apparent when that moment in time is supposed to have happened. Hulk and Bruce Banner have a complicated relationship for most of the 3 phases in the MCU. It's not until Endgame that we finally see them begin to coexist. The first time we see them co-interact occurs in Infinity War, but it's not a well-explained phenomenon. For instance, for the longest time through Thor Ragnarok, Banner cannot remember what Hulk does and his actions. Suddenly, for no reason, Bruce remembers explicitly that Thanos is coming even though Hulk is the one who saw him. Sure, it might be the first moment Hulk shares with Banner, but that's never explained. Next thing we know, Banner can't even get Hulk to come out, let alone share a thought. There was a time when everyone got hyped for the Easter egg of the Infinity Gauntlet in Odin's treasure room. We all figured this must be where Thanos gets his first stone and the gauntlet. He's gonna invade Asgard. Yeah, that never happened. It feels like everyone at Marvel forgot they snuck this in there. Suddenly, the crew for Thor Ragnarok needed to explain away this gauntlet. Otherwise, it'd be destroyed along with the rest of the Asgardians' home. Hela helps everyone out by calling it a fake. What? That whole time we're led to believe that Odin just held a fake there? Why? What was the point of that entire teaser? The Hulkbuster armor is nicknamed Veronica because Betty is the opposite of Veronica in the Archie comics. Bruce Banner was in love with Betty Ross, giving viewers the idea that Bruce does still think about Betty from time to time. Yet, whatever happened to her character? Bruce is a celebrity by the time Endgame rolls around. Why would Betty never come and see him? They never officially break up, but we're just led to believe that they mutually part ways, apparently? Even Thor got an explanation for why we never see Jane Foster with him. Where's the closure for Betty Ross? There's not even a whisper about how they resolved their relationship. Spider-Man: Homecoming is a great movie, but it's certainly not perfect. This plot hole is well known by MCU fans and one that's been confirmed by Kevin Feige. In the opening scene, we watch Adrian Toomes and his crew clean up the New York invasion's fresh wreckage. That would mean the current date there is in 2012. The movie then flashes forward to near the film's present day, but it says it's 8 years later. Yeah, that would mean that Spider-Man: Homecoming takes place in 2020. Obviously, the film doesn't actually take place at that time. The entire crew at Disney and Marvel essentially confirmed the error. Still, no one caught the plot hole until after the release. Mistakes happen, but this was a big one. Avengers: Age of Ultron has many flaws and some tiny narrative errors. However, the most awkward moment is the vision Thor has after Scarlet Witch messes with his mind. He sees a quick glimpse of the future we're all waiting for in the MCU. Then, Thor went to the reflection pool and we got the full teaser. Turns out, the moment was a forced scene to set up the next phase of films. Then, we waited all that time for nothing to ever come of his visions. He literally doesn't find out anything regarding the Infinity Stones on his search. He says as much in the opening of Thor Ragnarok. Talk about a huge letdown for this plot point. It's a hole that never got filled.
As much as we love Marvel movies, we have to admit that there have been some mistakes, lingering questions, and continuity errors along the way. Spider-Man: Homecoming totally messed up the Marvel timeline at the time, and Far From Home, well, it's far from perfect. We couldn't help but notice there were some pretty serious issues and unanswered questions lingering after the movie. So grab your pitchforks and let's celebrate the end of Phase 3 by poking some holes in Spider-Man: Far From Home. And yeah, there will be some major spoilers ahead. Marvel Studios is notoriously tight-lipped about their latest projects, but Spider-Man: Far From Home might have been its most secretive endeavor yet. Since it was released following Avengers: Endgame, a movie which had been built up for about a decade, it's understandable Marvel Studios didn't want to spoil their own movie. With that being said, we were of course eager to carefully examine everything we could in the lead up to Far From Home's release. But you don't have to look too closely to see that there was a massive movie poster mistake. In fact, someone with a single eye could probably notice that Nick Fury is wearing an eye patch over a different eye in various different movie posters. Out of all the consistency issues with Marvel movies, this one is particularly hilarious, and we're guessing it has to do with someone flipping a photo and not double checking their work. Filming a superhero movie is no easy task, especially when you're filming on location all over the world. The cast and crew of Far From Home did indeed travel to locations like Prague, Venice, and London, but they also relied on a little bit of movie magic. Peter Parker and Quentin Beck had a legendary showdown atop the iconic Tower Bridge in London, but a lot of what you see in the movie isn't the actual bridge. The crew was limited in terms of time, and they weren't allowed to stop traffic while filming, so they ended up building their own bridge to get the shots they needed, but initially, their set piece simply looked way too new. The crew ended up mixing paint with sawdust in order to create the old, more weathered look of the actual Tower Bridge. Thankfully, the final version ended up looking pretty darn close to the actual historical site. The crew definitely did their research when it came to Spider-Man Far From Home, but it turns out it was far from easy in many cases. Director John Watts loved the idea of the school vacation and the teenage characters being a focal point in the film, so he decided to do some fun research by watching movies featuring teenagers heading to Europe for summer break. There was just one problem with this plan. Apparently, that's not really a genre of movies, and Watts found himself sadly lacking reference material. Apparently, Peter Parker isn't the only kid who doesn't get a relaxing European vacation. Instead, Watts claims he drew inspiration from the movie If Looks Could Kill starring Richard Grieco. While it's certainly different from Far From Home in a lot of ways, Watts found it a useful starting point for the movie. I guess he could have just watched Eurotrip though. Not only is Far From Home a movie about a group of teenagers, but it's about a group of teens who entered back into existence pretty recently. The decimation was renamed the less insidious sounding blip, and we got an explanation of how it impacted high school students in the beginning of the movie. We saw a video of kids getting dusted during a basketball game, only to reappear during another one. But frankly, this raises a lot more questions than it answered. Like, what happened to the people who get dusted when they were on an airplane on their way to their own European vacation? Did they come back to life only to plummet to their doom? Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige claimed the Hulk was able to return people back to places that were safe, but we didn't see this established at any point on screen, at least during this movie. During Avengers Endgame, we saw what the world was like in the aftermath of Infinity War, and it was pretty darn bleak to say the least. It was so awful Clint Barton got that super unfortunate haircut and stopped wearing sleeves. Yet in Far From Home, everyone seems pretty cheery about what they experienced. Aunt May is working for a charity designed to help those who have been displaced by the blip, but for the most part, it seems like everyone is just kind of back to normal. Even if people were returned to safe places when they were brought back, what about people who didn't directly perish in the decimation, but as a result of it? You know, there had to be at least a handful of people who experienced car accidents because their Uber drivers suddenly got dusted into oblivion. We wonder if they were revived to see bad reviews on their account. We also have some practical concerns regarding the blip, which were never addressed in a satisfactory manner during Spider-Man Far From Home. Have you ever had to deal with the paperwork nightmare that is filling out a passport form? Or have you ever had to stand in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles to get your license renewed? Okay, now imagine that half of everyone on the world disappeared for 5 years, during which time they didn't age, but all their forms of identification probably expired. We know that Far From Home takes place 8 months after Endgame, but perhaps the most unbelievable part of the movie was that all these kids managed to get their passports taken care of in time for this trip. Flash Thompson does get busted on the airplane for technically being too young to drink, which makes us wonder if he was using an old identification card. But surely the government would have come up with a new system for blipped and non-blipped individuals. Of course, the blip would be a bureaucratic nightmare, but it would also be an emotional one. Could you imagine realizing you had missed out on 5 years while everyone around you grew and aged? Just think about all the Marvel movies you would have missed out on during that time. You'd be an entire phase behind everyone who didn't get blipped. Yet we really don't see anyone dealing with any emotional or psychological ramifications of the event. Peter is mourning the loss of Tony Stark, but that isn't really trauma resulting directly from the decimation. Then again, maybe everyone is okay because of the convenient plot armor which protected Peter and the majority of his classmates from getting dusted so that they could all stay the same age. In fact, we only got a brief glimpse that anyone other than Peter might be saddened by the events of Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. His school played a memorial video featuring the lovely voice of Whitney Houston and showing images of some of the heroes we recently said goodbye to. These include Tony Stark, Natasha Romanoff, Vision, and Steve Rogers. But wait, Steve Rogers isn't gone, he's just really old now. Sure, he's not Captain America anymore after passing the role on to Sam Wilson, but don't get the guy a casket just yet. This part was just kind of confusing considering that Steve was alive, well, and rocking a miraculously perfect set of teeth the last time we saw him. Did he pass away at some point off screen? Did he fake his own demise? Is the general public just assuming that he perished since he's not around anymore despite the fact that he spent several years on the run following Captain America Civil War? As much as we love Marvel movies, they haven't always managed to feature the most compelling villains. So it's all the more devastating when we finally get an interesting villain and they only make it into a single movie. We have to admit that we were pretty disappointed to learn the Vulture wouldn't be back for Far From Home, but at least we got Mysterio, though we aren't exactly sure if he's alive or not. But we do have some questions about how the blip affected existing villains like Adrian Toomes, who we saw at the prison at the end of Homecoming. If he was a victim of the decimation, does that time count towards his prison sentence? Or does he have to stay in prison for an additional 5 years? Depending on the logistics of the situation, we could see some old enemies back on the street sooner than we might have anticipated. One of the big reveals during Far From Home was that Nick Fury and Maria Hill had secretly been Skrulls for probably at least this entire movie. But what we want to know is how long have they been secretly Skrulls? During Captain Marvel, Nick Fury said he just can't eat toast that's cut diagonally, despite the fact that that's the completely objectively best way to consume baked goods. Yet during the movie Avengers Age of Ultron, we saw Fury preparing a sandwich and cutting the bread diagonally. Is this proof that Fury has been a secret Skrull for who knows how long? Is this a major Marvel movie continuity error? Or is it possible Fury has different rules regarding consuming toasted or non-toasted bread? Or are we just overthinking this? Perhaps we'll never know the real answer. Nick Fury's toast preferences are almost as complicated as trying to film a major motion picture somewhere other than a studio. You have to factor in costs, deal with the elements, and file permits, which is one of the least exciting parts of filmmaking. Prague was eager to have Far From Home filmed there and managed to woo producers away from filming in Budapest by offering certain incentives. However, there's one thing they couldn't accommodate, and that was filming on location at Old Town Square. In real life, it's a huge, busy place, and it would have been cost prohibitive to shut it down for filming. Instead, the place you see in the movie is actually located in Liberec, a city about an hour and a half north of Prague. Just something to keep in mind before you embark on a pricey Far From Home world tour. We know that Nick Fury and Maria Hill are secret Skrulls, but what about their other accomplices? We don't really get to know these black-clad people very well, but one of them, named Dimitri, managed to stand out. He started out as part of the mission before he just kind of disappeared. Comic book fans wondered if this Dimitri was supposed to be a Dimitri from the comic books. If the name Dimitri sounds unfamiliar, you might know him better as the Chameleon, the very first enemy Peter Parker ever fought during his career as Spider-Man. Although he's not a founding member, the Chameleon did join the Sinister Six at one point, a group many hoped would show up at some point during Far From Home. So was this Dimitri supposed to be the Chameleon? If not, then what's up with him and where did he go? Peter Parker has a lot of enemies, but he also has an impressive array of superpowers. Whether you prefer to call it his spider sense or his Peter tingle, this is arguably his most impressive ability. It allows him to sense danger and ensure he stays out of harm's way. Combined with his crazy powerful reflexes, it's pretty hard to land a blow on him, which is nice considering he's not exactly bulletproof. We finally got to see this power in action during Infinity War when it alerted Peter to the oncoming alien invasion. Yet during Far From Home, it's just kind of gone for most of the movie. In the comic books, Peter is able to willfully ignore his spider sense in order to conserve energy or focus his attention elsewhere. But in this movie, it just kind of goes away when Peter says he doesn't want to save the world, only to magically reappear later when it's convenient. Quentin Beck and his accomplices try to position Mysterio as the greatest hero the world has ever seen, and they're also intent on taking Spider-Man down several pegs. But why are they targeting this high school kid who doesn't even want to be a world-famous hero? We understand they have a grudge against Tony Stark, who they worked for during their time at Stark Industries, but why didn't they try taking on Tony when he was still alive? Heck, now that he's gone, there are still other targets that they could go after besides Tony Stark's fake son. How about his real daughter, Morgan Stark? Or his widow, Pepper Potts, who has control of his entire company, by the way. Or even his pal chauffeur, Happy Hogan. If Quentin Beck didn't make it a point to rope Peter into his elemental plan, they could have pulled all of this off without him ever interfering at all. In fact, it seems like the reason Quentin Beck got Peter Parker involved was to get his hands on Edith. You know, the ultra-powerful artificial intelligence concealed in a pair of sunglasses? But how did Quentin Beck even know about Edith in the first place? It seems like the disgruntled Stark Industries employees had been out of the loop for quite some time, and Tony was constantly coming up with new and innovative tech. Even if they knew about Edith, why didn't they take it when it was in the possession of somebody easier to bamboozle than a superhero who's been to outer space and fought against the Mad Titan himself? If they just waited long enough, Peter probably would have blown himself up using Edith, considering that his former mentor left him zero helpful instructions regarding this insanely powerful weapon. Marvel comic book fans know there are tons of timelines out there. The main timeline in the comics is known as Earth 616, or Earth Prime, but it's really just as valid as any of the other realities out there. During Far From Home, Peter Parker is thrilled to realize that the multiverse is a real thing. But is it really? We later learn Quentin Beck and his pals are really from boring old Earth 616 and not Earth 833 as he claims. Of course, this doesn't mean the MCU isn't a multiverse, but we didn't really get any confirmation either way. In the comic books, there is an Earth 833, or at least there was before it was destroyed. Interestingly enough, it was once home to a character known as Spider UK, who is essentially a combination of Spider-Man and Captain Britain. Even if Quentin was totally making things up, we definitely appreciate this small little comic book reference. If the multiverse is a real thing in the MCU, it would open up pretty much endless possibilities, including one we have to admit we never thought was possible. During the mid-credits scene of Far From Home, we caught a glimpse of the iconic Spider-Man character J. Jonah Jameson. Not only were we ecstatic to see him alive and well in the MCU, but we were shocked to see that he was played by actor J.K. Simmons. He didn't just look familiar because he's the mirror image of Jameson from the comic books, but because he also portrayed him in Sony's Spider-Man movies directed by Sam Raimi. Is Marvel Studios confirming the validity of Sony's own cinematic universe? Or was this just supposed to be a fun little cameo? Considering it left off on such a massive cliffhanger, we think there's definitely something more to the story. We just aren't sure what it is quite yet. We all know J. Jonah Jameson hates Spider-Man, probably as much as Quentin Beck and his pals probably hate Tony Stark. Which begs the question, why didn't they do their best to take down Stark Industries when he was still alive? There have been many times that it would have made sense for them to launch their attack previously. They could have done so after the events of Captain America Civil War, when the Avengers were fractured into various groups, or after the decimation when Tony essentially retired. The guy was living in a cabin in the woods, and still Quentin Beck and his cohorts didn't act until he was gone. Did their desire for revenge outweigh their fear of facing Iron Man? We know villains aren't usually renowned for their bravery, but it's kind of silly they waited for Tony to be gone so they could pick on his former protege. Okay, so this is one mistake you definitely noticed, but we have to point it out anyways because reasons. Peter Parker spends pretty much the whole movie protesting the idea that he could ever take up Iron Man's place. But he finally agrees to suit up while Happy Hogan puts on some epic theme music, and of course he chooses the classic song Back in Black, which was featured in the very first Iron Man movie. Everyone knows Tony Stark is a fan of the band, and he even used one of their songs as his entrance music in Iron Man 2. Yet as you probably know, Back in Black and Shoot to Thrill are both songs by the band AC/DC and not Led Zeppelin, as Peter said. Seriously, Peter, you need to add some classics to your litany of pop culture references. We know there's no way Marvel Studios could include every aspect of the comic books into the big screen. Of course, they're going to make minor changes and upgrades like making Quentin Beck an ex-Stark Industries employee instead of a special effects artist. But we're pretty confused about why they felt the need to include Talos in this movie, especially considering one major aspect of his biology in the comic books. We all know the Skrulls can change shape, except for Talos. That's right, in the comic books, Talos is a Skrull who is confined to a single form. So why did Marvel choose this name for this movie character? This guy's able to impersonate Nick Fury, but his comic book counterpart can't fool anyone at all. It's kind of a strange edit, but maybe they were just looking for one of the Skrulls with a name that people could actually pronounce.
The MCU is simply riddled with plot holes, inconsistencies, and other gaps that go against established logic and good old-fashioned common sense. Some of these plot holes are small and inconsequential, some are huge, eye-rolling mistakes, and some make things so much better. Today we're looking at plot holes that made your favorite Marvel movies awesome. Before you watch, click subscribe. You'll join our notification squad and be the first to know of new ScreenRant content. Fair warning, the following contains some MCU spoilers. By train, plane, or Bifrost. In the MCU, Asgard is linked to the other 9 realms, including Earth, via the Bifrost, which makes it an incredibly valuable piece of cosmic infrastructure. Infrastructure the God of Thunder smashed to bits at the end of 2011's Thor. So, with the Bifrost gone, how exactly does Thor get to Earth in 2012's The Avengers? Well, we're not entirely certain. Loki does mutter something about Odin using black magic, but that sounds pretty thin to us. What's more, Loki's something of a fibber, so we're not going to take his word for it. Fact is, it doesn't really matter, because you can't assemble Earth's mightiest heroes without Asgard's mightiest hero. Man, Thor's kind of a big deal, huh? Quill's Space Jams. When Peter Quill left Earth as a little boy, he didn't take much with him, except the memory of his mother, a Walkman, and a killer mixtape. A mixtape that provided Quill and his fellow Guardians with a sweet ass-kicking soundtrack to kick some ass to. There's only one problem. Where did he get replacement batteries for the Walkman? And how is he still listening to the same tape? Ask your grandparents and they'll tell you consumer-grade cassette tapes last 10 years tops. And even then, they can sound pretty scratchy. Will Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 reveal the location of the first interstellar Best Buy? Only time will tell.
Hey, Happy. Here's my report for tonight. I stopped a Grand Theft bicycle, couldn't find the owner, so I just left a note.
Spider-Man Timeline. While we're on the subject of times revealing properties, when does Spider-Man Homecoming take place? Well, the film opens in 2012 after the events of The Avengers, with Adrian Toomes and his crew scraping fresh Chitauri off of New York City asphalt. After they're kicked off the site by crusty bureaucrats, we flash forward 8 years to 2020? Given that Infinity War takes place in 2018, after the events of Homecoming, we'd call this a pretty big plot hole. Fans will surely come up with a clever way to explain the discrepancy, but we were just happy to see Keaton get his wings back and suit up in the MCU.
Power reduced to 19%.
The invincible Tony Stark. Far as we can tell, Tony Stark is just a man in a suit. A really, really rich guy in a really, really expensive suit. But he is a man, subject to the same laws of physics as the rest of us, which begs the question, how is he not dead? Even with the protection of the suit, he doesn't seem affected by high G-forces when pulling hairpin turns in the Battle of New York. Nor are his bones shattered by the concussive force of Thanos' famed right hook. Ask anyone shot while wearing a bulletproof vest. It stops the bullet, but it also knocks the wind out of you. By all metrics, Stark should have been liquefied before Phase 2, but we're glad he wasn't. Otherwise, who are we going to turn to for charming one-liners? The Hulk? Loki? Oh, right. Never mind.
Demeanor is that of a pouty child. And apparently, you alienated my favorite daughter, Gamora.
Thanos' Technicolor Gauntlet. We'll concede overpopulation is a huge problem, and Thanos' plan to wipe out half of all life made for some pretty high drama. But is it really the best use of his power? With all 6 Infinity Stones in his possession, Thanos is virtually omnipotent, which means he could just as easily double or triple all resources in the universe, effectively ending overpopulation with a snap of his fingers, and making Infinity War the most boring superhero film of all time.
This doesn't make any sense.
Nah, nothing makes sense here, man. The only thing that does make sense is that nothing makes sense.
The Marvel Cinematic Universe has a lot of moving pieces, and thus there's bound to be a few plot holes here or there. But are they actually plot holes if the power of magic can fix them? Sometimes the answer is yes, as these plot holes seem to make more sense once magic is used to justify them.
Showtime, a-holes!
Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the little bell to stay up to date with everything ScreenRant. Dark magic. In the first Avengers film, Thor was whisked away to Earth by the power of dark magic. Many fans thought this was a bit of a cop-out, as the Bifrost had been destroyed in the first film, and the screenwriters needed a quick and easy way to get Thor back to Earth. But as it turns out, Infinity War fixed this bit of lazy screenwriting. In order to send the Hulk back to Earth, Heimdall uses black magic, which is the power of Asgardian ancestors to manipulate the same energy in the Bifrost. It must come at quite the cost, as it's used in last resort situations, but now we know that is how Thor got back to Earth.
Hurts, doesn't it?
all Loki's fault. Thor Ragnarok set the record straight and confirmed there's only one Infinity Gauntlet, while Infinity War confirmed to audiences that Thanos only recently obtained his and not during the after credits scene of Ultron. But if Thanos only recently got his hands on the gauntlet, how come Odin didn't stop him? Well, Infinity War takes place only moments after Ragnarok, so there's a good chance Odin was alive when Thanos attacked the dwarves. He likely couldn't do anything to help them as he was bound in exile by Loki's magic spells though, forcing him to stay in Midgard. If Odin was in Asgard, this may have been avoided as Heimdall would have been the gatekeeper.
Don't do this.
What choice do we have?
Mutant powers. This one's a bit of a doozy. Leading into Ultron, we learned of the Maximoff twins, who were experimented on to become enhanced beings to fight the good fight for Hydra. The Mind Stone was used to give the enhanced powers of speed to Quicksilver and telekinesis to Scarlet Witch. So how does the Mind Stone create powers? And why are the siblings' powers so different? Bear in mind that the siblings are mutants in the comics, so the Mind Stone likely acted as a way to unlock the genes already in their bodies. The Mind Stone forced their genetics to unlock their full potential.
My name is Dr. Stephen Strange.
Doctor Strange's future. In Infinity War, Doctor Strange peeked into the future and saw over 14 million outcomes in the battle against Thanos. Of all those outcomes, only one of them saw them victorious. Of course, things seemed to go bad from then on out, with characters dying and making poor decisions in the heat of battle. Of course, there's been more plot holes since that decision was made, but one can actually argue that any plot hole that happens as of that point in the film is actually part of the plan, and whatever happened is exactly what needed to happen in order to win.
I hope they remember you.
How did Thanos know Tony's name? In Infinity War, fans may have noticed a puzzling line during the battle between Thanos, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Strange, and some of the Guardians. He directly calls out Tony by name, but just how would Thanos know Iron Man's real name if the two characters never interacted and Thanos never visited Earth? While this could be seen as a plot hole, it's likely that the magical properties of the Mind Stone transferred knowledge to Thanos, who in turn learned of Tony's public "I am Iron Man" moment. If that's true, then all the secrets, history, and strategies of the Avengers have all been exposed to Thanos.
Even if you haven't managed to make it to your local movie theater to watch Captain Marvel, you're probably aware that the latest installment in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is set in the past. The 21st movie in the MCU was actually set in 1995, which saw the pasts of the likes of Nick Fury, Phil Coulson, and S.H.I.E.L.D. explored for the first time on the big screen. Inevitably, this has resulted in some problems with regards to the franchise's timeline, as a number of plot holes and retcons have come to light. In this video, we'll run you through just a few of them. Arguably, the biggest retcon in Captain Marvel is the reason Nick Fury formed the Avengers in the first place. The concept was first introduced in the post-credits scene in 2008's Iron Man, the first movie of the MCU.
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
It was then gradually revealed that Fury's ultimate plan with the initiative was to bring together a team of remarkable people who could fight the battles nobody else on planet Earth could. But Captain Marvel revealed that Samuel L. Jackson's character got the idea for it way back in 1995, when he learned that there were greater powers out there and saw Carol Danvers' U.S. Air Force call sign. He correctly deduced that if the universe has one superhero, there will undoubtedly be others out there, and that assembling them would be a great idea. It's a sensible retcon, slotting into pre-established MCU canon, but it does make you wonder why it took Fury so long to execute the initiative. Having proposed it 13 years earlier, he didn't get to work on it until 2008. Tie-in comics may provide the answer, suggesting that the World Security Council didn't really believe in the idea. So Fury ended up being stalled by a bureaucratic system for a whole lot longer than he would have liked. After coming up with the idea for the initiative to create the team, just why did Nick Fury choose to call his team the Avengers? The title's been regarded as something of an inaccurate description to date in the MCU. Up until recently, they've been utilized as a first response unit to deal with major impending crises. And until their failure to stop Thanos from wiping out half of all life in last year's Avengers Infinity War, they haven't really had anything to avenge in the first place. Tony Stark may have used the term back in 2012,
The Avengers.
but in terms of inspiration, it's just been assumed that Fury simply liked the name. However, Captain Marvel revealed that Fury was in fact inspired by Carol Danvers herself. While he was originally planning to call his proposal the Protector Initiative, he changed it after seeing Danvers' Avenger call sign. In a way, that does indeed mean that Fury simply liked the name, but there was a lot more personal weight behind it than was first made apparent. The retcon does make a whole lot of sense, establishing a neat narrative through line between Captain Marvel and the Avengers, but it's a retcon nonetheless, and at the same time, it does feel a little on the nose and unnecessary. 11 years ago in Iron Man, Clark Gregg's Agent Coulson introduced himself to Gwyneth Paltrow's Pepper Potts.
I'm Agent Phil Coulson with the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division.
Potts told Coulson that was quite a mouthful, and he gave a memorable response saying, "I know, we're working on it." Later in the movie, the problem was solved, as Coulson told Potts to just call us S.H.I.E.L.D.
From the Strategic Homeland and
just call us S.H.I.E.L.D.
And it felt as though it was something of an origin for the organization. However, Captain Marvel sees Nick Fury introducing himself as an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. more than a decade before that, which straight up contradicts the very first MCU movie. If truth be told, Marvel Studios had long since decided to ignore that particular line of dialogue from Iron Man. In 2014's Captain America the Winter Soldier, Toby Jones's Arnim Zola claimed he was recruited by S.H.I.E.L.D. in the 1940s. Michael Douglas's Hank Pym uses the acronym when referring to his pre-Iron Man time with the organization in Ant-Man. And it spills over into TV too, with Agent Carter and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. using the same name during events set before the turn of the new millennium. Captain Marvel is simply continuing a tradition in that sense. The Avengers movie strongly implied that the Chitauri invasion of Earth in 2012 was the first time aliens had attempted to invade the planet since the Asgardians drove the Frost Giants back over in the year 965, a battle that was briefly depicted on screen in the opening scenes of 2011's Thor. Captain Marvel, however, reveals that wasn't entirely true. The Kree had arrived on Earth, or C-53 as they called it, all the way back in 1995, and they even attempted to launch a massive orbital bombardment on the planet. Fortunately for everyone around the globe, Ronan the Accuser's forces were defeated in extremely emphatic fashion by Carol Danvers, who had just gained access to the full extent of her incredible powers. The end result was Ronan fleeing, along with his allies, out of sheer fear of the powerful individual he described simply as the Woman. While it's never stated explicitly, it's subsequently implied that Danvers is seen as Earth's protector by the fleeing aliens, and that other potential invaders would be scared away, thinking she would stop them. Nick Fury would later suggest the Avengers represented the first deterrent to potential invaders. And this is a very subtle Captain Marvel retcon, though it does at least explain why no more hostile extraterrestrials paid any attention to Earth until 2012. One of the biggest MCU mysteries that Captain Marvel provides an answer to is how Nick Fury lost his eye. After the good guys defeated the Kree, Goose the Flurkin scratched it, presumably infecting it as the severity of the effects of the scratch increased over time, until Fury simply couldn't see out of it. It's admittedly a little different to what MCU fans envisioned might have happened, but it isn't necessarily a retcon. When discussing the idea of betrayal with Steve Rogers in 2014's Captain America the Winter Soldier, Fury said,
"Last time I trusted someone, I lost an eye."
And that trust could of course have been trust in Goose, despite what we might have imagined. But what makes the whole thing a plot hole is a more innocuous scene in Captain America the Winter Soldier. When Robert Redford's Alexander Pierce was discussing Fury's past, he showed a photograph of him being signed in as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And he still had 2 functioning eyes in the picture, suggesting he didn't lose sight in his left eye until after his promotion. It won't have been something Marvel Studios wanted to use as evidence to dictate an entire story at the time, however, so it is at least somewhat excusable, and we certainly won't hold it against them. It's not only the story of Nick Fury's left eye that Captain Marvel contradicts. His entire backstory in the MCU gets retconned by the movie. In 2010's Iron Man 2, Fury spoke about the fact that he had a close working relationship with Howard Stark, even saying he knew him better than Tony knew him, which meant that he should have already been a high-level S.H.I.E.L.D. agent by the time Stark died in 1991. Stark Sr. wouldn't have worked closely with just any old S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. Then, 4 years later in Captain America the Winter Soldier, Alexander Pierce said that Fury was made director of S.H.I.E.L.D., after first encountering him as head of the organization's Bogota station long before the 1990s. Captain Marvel discards those things, because in the mid-90s, Fury was still only a level 3 operative, a relatively low-level S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who had been running a small local team and even considered himself to be little more than a glorified desk jockey. Frankly, there's no way to make these contrasting versions of events sync up without your brain exploding. While it could be argued that Fury might have crossed paths with Howard before he joined up with S.H.I.E.L.D., back when he was working as a spy during the Cold War, it's definitely a reach. And it wouldn't explain him knowing Howard better than his son did. This entry regarding the history of the Tesseract is a little different to the others in this video, as it doesn't actually retcon anything at all. But it does add a new layer of complexity to the story of the Space Infinity Stone, and some fans have claimed it is indeed a retcon. As far as anybody knew, the Tesseract was recovered by Howard Stark at some point after the events of Captain America: The First Avenger, and was studied by Project Pegasus, which is where Loki teleported in at the start of the Avengers. As revealed in Captain Marvel, by 1989, a rogue Kree scientist, Annette Bening's Mar-Vell, had taken charge of Pegasus' work on the Tesseract, and was using its energies to develop a faster-than-light engine. She eventually managed to quietly steal it, hiding it on a cloaked Kree ship in Earth's orbit. But she died in 1989 when the Kree intervened and shot her test plane down. And the Tesseract was only recovered in 1995, before being swallowed by Goose and later coughed up on Nick Fury's desk, at which point he returned it to Pegasus for further study. While many may have cried foul, there really aren't any continuity issues here. All Captain Marvel shows is one of the directions the Tesseract went in between Howard Stark finding it and the events of the first Avengers movie. In that first Avengers movie, it was revealed that S.H.I.E.L.D. was using the Tesseract to develop energy weapons similar to those used by Hydra during World War II, a secret project known as Phase 2. Nick Fury's justification for the project's existence was Thor's arrival on Earth.
Me.
With the S.H.I.E.L.D. director claiming that humanity's first contact with aliens had forced him to find new armaments. Specifically, he said Earth had learned that not only are we not alone, but we are hopelessly and hilariously outgunned. But Captain Marvel changed all of that. The latest MCU offering revealed that Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. had known about the existence of aliens since at least 1995. 16 years before the events of Thor, when they encountered individuals from both the Skrull and Kree races. It would make a lot more sense if Fury started looking into the idea of making weapons with the Tesseract after Goose coughed it up into his office in the post-credits scene. He'd seen what the Skrulls, the Kree, and indeed Carol Danvers were capable of, and definitely would have been wary of more extraterrestrial invaders. Especially after Danvers departed the Earth and left it without a superpowered defender. Even though she did tell Fury to contact her in an emergency, that didn't mean she'd necessarily be instantly on hand to assist whenever he decided to contact her. Like Samuel L. Jackson, actor Clark Gregg was also subjected to age regression CGI for the Captain Marvel movie, in order to look approximately 25 years younger than he does now. But something about his appearance doesn't add up at all. Coulson was resurrected in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. using a serum derived from Kree DNA. But he didn't show any hint of already knowing who the Kree were when he was told what brought him back to life. Yet he literally encountered the race a couple of decades earlier in the Captain Marvel movie. And that's not something somebody forgets. Even if we didn't actually see Coulson interacting with the Kree, he clearly knew about them, as he played a big part in the story and spoke of office gossip claiming Nick Fury lost his eye during Kree torture. To put it simply, this is a really tough one to just explain away. The late great Stan Lee's cameos are a staple tradition in the MCU.
Superheroes in New York? Give me a break.
And they're all the more special after the legendary comic book creator passed away in November of last year. Marvel Studios has gone as far as developing something of a mythology around them, with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 confirming that all the cameos are the same person, a Watcher's informant who can seemingly transcend time and space. But Lee's cameo in Captain Marvel is different, as he's actually playing himself. Lee can be seen on a train reading the script for Kevin Smith's 1995 movie Mallrats, apparently learning his lines for the cult classic in which he cameoed more than 2 decades ago.
Trust me, true believer.
While it's certainly a touching tribute, it actually doesn't make much sense. If Stan Lee exists in the MCU, how could he possibly have created the characters who star in it? And if he didn't create them, did he write other famous comic book superheroes in the MCU? Or is he known for doing something else entirely? And if Lee himself is actually the Watcher's informant, wouldn't somebody have noticed a celebrity who didn't appear to age?
Don't make me come down there, you punk!
Of course, this particular cameo was added as a tongue-in-cheek way of paying homage to Lee, so while it doesn't work when you stop and think about it, that really doesn't matter. It's a respectful nod to a Marvel legend, not a meaningful plot point. Marvel Studios' Black Panther is now playing in theaters around the world, and it's proving to be a huge success both critically and commercially. But that's not to say it doesn't have some problems. For example, in the mid-credits scene when T'Challa addresses the UN about Wakanda's true nature, there's a Welsh flag, which would suggest Wales as a separate nation to the United Kingdom. Uh-oh.
Are you finished?
There are other issues more related to the plot, however, and that's what we're going to look into in this video. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It's the best way of keeping up to date with all of Screen Rant's great new content. And during the video, can you count how many times Kevin Feige randomly appears? Stick around until the end to find out if you counted correctly. Look, there's absolutely no denying how brilliant and groundbreaking Black Panther is, but we certainly have some questions about some of its plot holes, so let's get started. The first question relates to one of the first scenes in the movie, in the museum in London. Killmonger was only working with Claw to use his corpse to get into Wakanda, so what was the point in going to that museum to steal the Wakandan item? Surely he could have just killed Claw and taken him to the fictional nation, and for that matter, why let Claw go off to South Korea, get captured, and then have to bust him out of a CIA safe house? He could have saved him a lot of hassle and negated the need to kill his own girlfriend if he'd just killed Claw to begin with. More to the point, how did the museum heist go so well? Claw left behind a number of bodies and left without anyone having raised the alarm. That museum should have been surrounded by police, and the ambulance Claw escaped in should have been seen pulling out from the alley behind the museum and pursued. It was all very convenient. And how exactly did Killmonger know that the Wakandan item in the museum was from Wakanda in the first place? There was literally no reason for him to be able to know that. I guess maybe there's some kind of markings or something that somebody with his background might be able to recognize. But who knows? There's also a question regarding how he got to Wakanda. It makes sense that he would know more about it than most people thanks to his father's journals and so forth, but he knew exactly how to gain access to the country, which simply doesn't make sense. And it was incredibly convenient that he handed over Claw's body to someone whose response would stir up the most trouble. By the way, what's up with Claw's aging process? In the movie's flashback scenes in 1992, T'Chaka and Zuri look like considerably younger men than they do a quarter of a century later, but Claw's barely changed in that time. He had a little less gray hair in 92, but that was really the only difference. Also, given that Killmonger's motive in the movie was his father N'Jabu being killed by T'Chaka, why didn't T'Chaka remove N'Jabu's corpse from his apartment after he killed him? Not doing so ensured that young Eric would find his corpse and see the Panther Claw wounds and, as a result, know who murdered him. The next questions relate to the movie's main setting, Wakanda. Given that vibranium is the source of all their wealth, where and how are they getting all that money from? If they don't trade with other countries, and bearing in mind that other countries don't even know they possess vibranium in the first place, who's providing them with their wealth? And how have they remained so hidden? They clearly have access to the same internet as everybody else. Chudi's reference to the "what are those" meme made that clear. Ugh. That was awkward. So, how hasn't the access to the internet been noticed, logged, and checked out? S.H.I.E.L.D. clearly had them on their radar back in 2010's Iron Man 2. Their map of notable locations around the world was proof of that, so it's a mystery as to why they haven't previously been outed. On a related note, what on earth was T'Challa thinking when he left his tech out in the field? Wakanda is impeccably secretive. Yet when T'Challa stopped the Nigerian militia at the beginning of the movie, he left vibranium tech on their cars. Then later in the movie in South Korea, he left several pieces of tech just laying around that anybody could discover and study. If that kind of thing was a regular occurrence, how on earth did Wakanda manage to remain hidden from the outside world? I guess they probably have some sort of cleanup crew. Who do you think works on the Wakandan cleanup crew? Are they just regular Joes or a special squad? It's also a mystery as to why Wakandans speak English. They were never colonized, and it's safe to assume that most of the people in the country have never left it. They even have their very own language. So how the heck have they managed to acquire English as one of their two main languages? Obviously, as we previously mentioned, the country must have internet access, but that doesn't explain why their entire population has been fluent for several generations. That's not to say they would be incapable of learning English. It's more a matter of Wakandan would probably be a more efficient, futuristic language than English. Something better, something more efficient. Going back to that fight with the Nigerian militia, why did the Wakandans just abandon the women they saved from said Nigerians? Okoye told the women to return home and speak nothing of the events they just saw, essentially leaving them to traverse thick, dangerous jungles in the middle of the night, even though there was plenty of room in the Wakandan ship, which they could have used to at least take them a little closer to home. Going back to the events in Korea, given that King T'Chaka spearheaded the Sokovia Accords, aren't the actions of T'Challa Okoye and Nakia completely contradicting Wakanda's supposed support of them, their actions in Korea were no better than those of the Avengers in terms of spilling blood on foreign soil and taking things into their own hands. Shouldn't they be held accountable for their actions as well? And given that the casino in Korea was meant to be a secret, what was Claude doing turning up with an entourage and a convoy of black SUVs? Wasn't that just a bit of a giveaway? And remember how Nakia's entire car disintegrated in the big chase in Korea, yet she was sent scooting down the road in an entirely undamaged driver's seat. Wasn't that a nice coincidence? I mean, sure, he could have designed some kind of vibranium roll cage or something. More than anything, it was the fact that Nakia was still somehow holding on to the steering wheel. How loosely was that thing bolted on? We'd also love to know how vibranium can do everything that it's shown to be able to do. It's an amazing metal, sure, but it's just a metal. How on earth did it heal Everett Ross's wounds and paralysis in a day, for example? Shooty explained it off as a function of vibranium, but how? That bit was conveniently left out. Speaking of Shooty, how has there been enough time to conceive and implement all of her ideas? We know she's a genius, but she's only 16. She can't have been in charge of Wakanda's R&D department for more than a few years, yet she's been able to design and oversee the construction of an entire high-speed rail system. That alone would have needed a decade to construct. Are we expected to believe that she'd invented it by the time she was 6 years old? Who knows? Maybe there just isn't as much red tape to Wakandan engineering projects. Oh, and Shirley also said that the footwear on T'Challa's armor made his footsteps completely silent. So why is it that his footsteps can be heard throughout the movie when he's wearing it? The impact of his feet is audible both during fight scenes and when he's simply walking around. That to me screams like a miscommunication between the Foley people and the script department. And what about T'Challa surviving that fall during his first fight against Killmonger? It wasn't as though he had the powers granted by the heart-shaped herb to increase his durability. He'd very specifically had them removed and was just a normal human at the time. Even though he fell into water, the distance he plummeted and the way he hit the water with the broadside of his body should have turned him into heart-shaped jelly. Straight up. Speaking of T'Challa's fall, how was he subsequently kept alive by snow? M'Baku said he was in a coma and that removing him from the snow would have killed him within moments. What the heck was that all about? Cooling a body will restrict blood flow, of course, but there's no reason it should have kept T'Challa alive. Oh, right, it was probably some kind of vibranium-infused snow or something like that. Questions will also have to be asked about why Nakia only grabbed one heart-shaped herb to take to M'Baku when Killmonger was set to burn them all. Those herbs are extremely important to Wakanda, and she had a very clear and easy chance to grab at least a couple. The fact that she would only grab one really makes no sense at all. Oh, and finally, if the Jabari tribe are vegetarians like M'Baku suggested, why do they have fishermen? And what are they doing wearing fur? Nah, just kidding. We actually understand that he was only trolling T'Challa when he made that vegetarian claim.
As entertaining as comic book movies are, one thing they've classically lacked over the years is airtight storytelling. The action is usually exciting, the special effects are often state-of-the-art, and the visuals are usually a colorful aesthetic treat. But all of that becomes moot if the plot sucks. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has attempted to buck the trend of poor plots in the genre. Movies like Iron Man, Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Guardians of the Galaxy were great productions by any standards. But that doesn't mean the franchise hasn't suffered from some glaring plot holes. Just for clarity, plot holes are logical inconsistencies within a story. They can include things like inexplicable or impossible events occurring, or events that contradict earlier events in the storyline. And you might be surprised at just how many there have been in the MCU. Here are 10 unforgivable plot holes in Marvel movies. Captain America vs. the Red Skull. In 2011's Captain America the First Avenger, there's a sequence of events that results in an outcome that was, frankly, incredibly implausible. Cap storms Red Skull's Hydra base alone and ends up getting captured. He's taken to a room in the base where he meets the Nazi supervillain, and then Cap's friends happen to burst through the window to save him. This scenario relied on way too many assumptions. How did Cap know he'd be captured and not killed? That base was huge. How did he know the room he'd be taken to would be the one his friends were going to burst into? How did he know the glass they smashed in order to enter wasn't bulletproof? It's all far too convenient to be taken seriously. The Bifrost problem. In 2011's Thor movie, it was Loki's plan to open the Bifrost, the bridge connecting Asgard to the rest of the 9 realms around the universe, and use its energies to destroy the realm of Jotunheim to prove himself worthy of ruling Asgard to Odin. In order to prevent him from doing that, Thor destroyed the Bifrost, which resulted in him being trapped on Asgard, away from Jane Foster, his Earth-based lover. Thor was devastated as a result, and yet in 2012's The Avengers, he arrived on Earth as soon as he felt he was needed there, with a half-baked explanation about Odin using dark energy to send him back.
How much dark energy did the All-Father have to muster to conjure you here?
If it was that easy, why was he so devastated in the first place? Why didn't he just ask Odin to send him back to Jane earlier? Everyone knows where everyone else is going. In 2012's The Avengers, everyone seems to have an uncanny knack of just knowing where other individuals are heading, simply because it suited the plot. But it really made no sense. Okay, for instance, Tony Stark assumed that Loki wanted to be seen by the masses conquering Earth, describing him as wanting a monument with his name plastered on it.
Son of a bitch.
And he immediately knew that that meant he'd set up camp at Stark Tower. How? There are literally thousands of buildings on Earth that would have provided Loki with what he needed. Moreover, how did Bruce Banner know exactly where to find his fellow Avengers in the huge city of New York? Seriously, this kind of thing was far too prevalent in the Avengers. Bruce Banner's anger. The degree over which Bruce Banner has control over his anger and transformations into the Hulk is something that really needs to be clarified. In 2012's The Avengers, the trauma caused by an attack on the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier triggered an involuntary transformation. But Bruce later proclaimed that he was always angry, and therefore had total control over his transformations. Then in 2015's Avengers Age of Ultron, Scarlet Witch was able to trigger an involuntary transformation that even made the Hulk get into a fight with his good friend Tony Stark. Granted, this transformation was triggered by the mysterious powers of the aforementioned Maximoff twin, but it still suggests that Banner isn't quite in control of his body as a major plot point in the Avengers would have us believe. The fall of the Chitauri. At the end of 2012's The Avengers, Iron Man single-handedly defeats the invading Chitauri army by diverting a nuclear missile towards their mothership. Every last one of them drops dead when the ship is destroyed. How? Before the nuking, there was absolutely no evidence of the Chitauri operating under a hive mind, and they weren't cybernetic beings, so there's no reason that the destruction of a ship should have resulted in their deaths. It just seemed like far too convenient a method of ensuring that they were all accounted for. Tony Stark and the Extremis. 2013's Iron Man 3 ended with Tony Stark having learned everything there was to know about Aldrich Killian's Extremis formula. As a result, he not only stabilized it in order to cure Pepper Potts of its effects, he also used it to enable surgeons to remove shrapnel and the arc reactor from his chest without killing him. And yet he hasn't used it since. Why? A stabilized Extremis could have been used to save lives and regrow limbs. Stark had the intelligence to make it into an extremely useful applied tool, but he decided to bury it in the archives? That's kinda hard to believe, especially given that Stark and his friends are in the dangerous business of being superheroes. Everlasting 80s technology. It's not a stretch to call Star-Lord's Walkman a major plot point in 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy. It's extremely important to the heroic outlaw. It keeps him going, and it's the only remaining connection he has to his late mother and his home planet of Earth. But how the hell is it still working? Chris Pratt's character left Earth 26 years prior to the events in the movie, and unless they have AA batteries in space, that Walkman should have died a long time ago. And that's without even mentioning the general wear and tear on both the device itself and the tape inside it, as well as the fact that Star-Lord often finds himself in the kind of dangerous situations that would see it taking a regular beating. English, the universal language. It isn't only the Marvel Cinematic Universe in which this inexplicably happens, but it's still something that should bug you. Planet Earth alone consists of about 6,500 spoken languages, and yet we're expected to believe that the majority of the rest of the universe conveniently speaks perfect English? 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy revealed that the Xandarians, Kree, Zehoberi, Centaurians, Lufamoids, Killorians, Space Raccoons, and even the Mad Titan Thanos are just some of the beings in the MCU that are fluent English speakers.
His vocabulistics is limited to I and am and Groot.
How is that remotely possible? Avengers assemble, but only when it suits them. Ever since the assembling of the Avengers in the 2012 movie, questions have been asked about why any of the team's individual members have had to deal with villain problems on their own. Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America have all had their issues, with Aldrich Killian and his Extremis army, Malekith and the Dark Elves, and the Winter Soldier and Hydra respectively. So why didn't their heroic teammates offer some assistance? In a world where the Avengers and even S.H.I.E.L.D. make it their business to turn up whenever there's trouble brewing, it's hard to believe that Thor had to deal with what was essentially another alien invasion on his own, or that the 3 helicarriers that were targeting thousands of people considering to be threats to Hydra were only opposed by Captain America. Captain America's shield. Captain America's shield is awesome, of that there's no doubt. But it's also one gigantic plot hole. It seems to pick and choose when it works depending on the situation. For instance, it'll easily absorb the impact of Thor's hammer, and it'll deflect Tesseract-powered energy weapons without any problems. But when the Winter Soldier throws a grenade and Cap holds up his shield to absorb the impact, he gets brutally launched from an interstate to the underpass below. And when Cap uses it as a projectile, it also seems to pick and choose what it'll bounce off of and what it'll wedge itself into. And let's not get into the fact that it blocks every single bullet or projectile fired at Cap, even when 90% of his body is totally exposed. Thanks for watching our list of 10 unforgivable plot holes in Marvel movies. Did these plot holes bug you? Did we leave any major examples out? Let us know in the comment section below, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more great videos like this one.